Someone made a comment on an organic gardening Facebook group. It went something like this. I've been gardening for quite a while, and I've always used Miracle-Gro 312 fertilizer, and I got great results. Healthy plants, lots of produce. My vegetables were great. Then I switched to organic fertilizer. I used fish heads, compost, manure, all the good stuff. The plants were smaller, my yields were smaller, I produced a lot less vegetables in the same space. Why is that? This is a very common problem with using organic fertilizer. Now, don't get me wrong, organic fertilizer is good for the garden and is something you should be using, but it does have its limitations. And there are two key problems with it that most gardeners do not understand. Because they don't understand those products, they use them incorrectly, and they end up with poor results. In this video, I'm going to review those two problems, and at the end, I'll give you some ways to overcome those problems so that you can continue using organic fertilizer. So what is organic fertilizer? Well, what most people use is some form of compost, either their own compost or purchased compost in bags, or manure or composted manure. Vermicompost is also popular. These products are all very similar. Now, there are other types of organic fertilizer, and my comments here will also apply to those, but my focus here will be on compost. Now, most compost has an NPK of 1:1:1. That's the ratio. Now, a lot of it does not have quite that much in it, so a lot of it is labeled as being 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. But again, that's a 1:1 ratio. This ratio is a problem when you're trying to feed plants. And here's why it's a problem. Plants like to get their nutrients in a ratio of 3:1:2. 3 times as much nitrogen as the phosphate, and 2 times as much potassium as the phosphate. Now, some plants like a little more potassium, so a 3:1, 2.5 works also. If you take this compost and apply it to your plant so the plants get enough phosphate, you're going to be lacking in nitrogen. And nitrogen is key for plant growth. If they don't get enough, it stunts their growth. On the other hand, if you take that compost and you apply it so you're giving enough nitrogen, now we're adding more so we get up to that 3 number, you're adding too much phosphate. And too much phosphate can be toxic to plants. And this is the problem. Plants want a 3:1:2, but all you have available is a 1:1:1. There is no way to feed your plants so they get the right amount of nitrogen and the right amount of phosphate. There's a secondary issue with this, and that has to do with what nutrients do in soil. So when I apply nitrogen to soil, it runs away very quickly. If you get a rain, it washes away. It goes deeper into the soil away from plant roots. It moves very quickly through the soil profile. Phosphate, on the other hand, is the exact opposite. It hardly moves at all. When we apply phosphate to the soil, it stays at the surface. It never gets down to the roots. It can take years for that phosphate to make it to the roots. So I apply my 1:1:1 compost. Within a few days or a week, the nitrogen is gone, it's run away, and the phosphate remains behind. Now I put on more compost. The nitrogen runs away and the phosphate stays behind. So over time, you get a buildup of phosphate, but you're already putting on too much. So the problem just gets worse and worse every year, and it doesn't take long before your garden doesn't produce well because you have too much phosphate and not enough nitrogen. The second key problem with organic fertilizer has to do with the form that these nutrients are in. So when I buy synthetic fertilizer, those nutrients are already in what we call plant available form. For example, the phosphate is a phosphate molecule. Plants can use it right away. The nitrogen is generally nitrate, could be nitrite or even urea, but all 3 of those are available to plants very quickly. So if I feed my plants on Monday with synthetic fertilizer, by the afternoon and the next day, plants are able to use those nutrients. They're 100% plant available. Now let's have a look at organic fertilizer. It's a completely different story there. Almost all of the nitrogen and phosphate is not plant available. The nitrogen is tied up in large molecules like protein. The phosphate is tied up in large molecules like DNA molecules or ATP. Plants can't use those nutrients. They're there, they're in the compost, but they're not plant available. Now, potassium's a little different. Potassium does not get incorporated into large molecules, so it's readily available to plants. But that's not true of nitrogen and phosphate. So how quickly do they become available? As a general rule of thumb, compost decomposes and releases these nutrients over a 5-year period. And this is finished compost. So you go through your composting process, it's nice and black, it's finished, you put it on your soil, you think you're feeding the plants, but you're not. All those nutrients are still tied up. The composting process is going to continue for years, slowly releasing nutrients along the way. So if we take this compost and put it on our plants on Monday, on Tuesday, the plants have nothing to eat. It takes weeks and months before those nutrients become available. And then only a portion of the nutrients are available each year. Now that's great for long-term soil building. Organic material is really important for building up the structure of your soil, for building up the micropopulation in your soil. That's its real value. But as far as providing nutrients today, it's a poor choice. And what happens if you don't feed your plants? Well, they don't grow as well. So you get smaller plants and lower yields. So it's not that organic fertilizers are inherently bad. You just have to know how to use them. So how do you overcome these problems? Well, there are a couple of options. One is that you can find organic fertilizers that give you the right nutrients. So you can buy several different things and mix them together. For instance, you can use compost to provide that phosphate, but now we need more nitrogen to compensate. If you use something like blood meal, that has a very high amount of nitrogen and is released in a matter of weeks and months, not years. So mixing a lot of blood meal in with your compost works. Now, unfortunately, blood meal is fairly expensive, so it's an expensive source of nitrogen. The other alternative is you mix compost with some synthetic fertilizer. Use the compost to provide the phosphate, and then add some urea to add the nitrogen. Urea is a man-made organic compound, and it releases that nitrogen very quickly, and it's extremely inexpensive relative to the cost of other fertilizers. Urea is a 4600, so in a bag of fertilizer you get a lot of nitrogen. So mix that nitrogen with your compost and you get a perfect blend of a 3-1-2. Now we need a little more potassium, and you can add potassium in a number of different ways. One is wood ash. So if you have acidic soil, add some wood ash in there and that will add the extra potassium. Now wood ash is not a good idea if your soil is alkaline, and I have a separate video to discuss wood ash. You can also use kelp products. Kelp has a fairly high amount of potassium. And remember, potassium is not locked up in large molecules, so it's released more quickly. So adding kelp to your compost will also work. Or you can add some synthetic fertilizer. Something like potassium sulfate would be great, particularly if you have alkaline soil. Potassium chloride also works. That adds the potassium and it's immediately available to plants. So I hope you understand organic fertilizers a little better. Used incorrectly, they don't produce good yield and they don't produce good plants. But the stuff is great for long-term soil building, so keep using it. But when you're trying to grow vegetables and your focus is crops in a couple weeks or a couple months, synthetic fertilizer usually works better. Now in your ornamental beds, we don't care about yield. We can have things grow slower. And there you don't use synthetic fertilizer, you use your compost. I hope this makes sense to you. It's a critical thing to understand, and 95% of the gardeners out there don't understand these two problems. And so you'll see a lot of statements online which really don't make a lot of sense. Now, this isn't new science that I'm giving you. This science has been known for a long time. It's just not well understood by gardeners. Understanding soil and nutrients is critical for gardeners. And if you want to learn more about this subject, have a look at my book, Soil Science for Gardeners. And I'll put a link to it right here. Have a great summer in the garden.